Okay, so thank you very much and welcome everybody to the, what is it, October already? October meeting of the Cambridge Commons. And we're very pleased you could join us. We have today someone who I started speaking to back in June 2020 about the possibility of doing some research around inequalities in Cambridge. Eleanor Daws has just graduated from the University of York in Human Geography and Environment, and we're very pleased that she decided to write her undergraduate thesis looking at digital and energy inequalities in Cambridge, and particularly going out to speak to households and interview some of the third sector organisations that are involved in trying to address some of these inequalities. And I'm particularly pleased because, you know, we always like to encourage the next generation of campaigners on inequality, and particularly people who have real knowledge and insight into the issue. I can see that we've got some distinguished guests with us today from the City Council, including the Chief Executive as well, which is great. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome, Eleanor. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to you whenever you're ready.
So hello, my name's Eleanor, and today I'll be talking about energy and digital inequalities in Cambridge. And Tarek, wait, let me move on to the next slide.
Right, okay. In the bottom left-hand corner, if you hover over that, you'll see some faint icons that appear.
Oh, yeah, there we go. I've got it. Thank you. So first of all, I'll be introducing my research, and then I'll be looking at the situation in Cambridge, followed by energy inequalities, and then digital inequalities, and finishing by closing Cambridge's digital divide. So an introduction to myself, as Tarek said, in June 2021, I graduated from the University of York with a BA in Human Geography and the Environment. I have later decided to continue my studies, doing a master's in corporate sustainability and environmental management. Before attending the University of York, I did my A-levels at Mander Portman Woodward, Cambridge. I attended secondary school at Bassingbourn Village College, just outside Cambridge. And when I'm not studying, I'm currently the captain of the University of York's cheerleading team, and I volunteer for a student mental health charity. So my research was undertaken as part of my third year dissertation project. I aim to understand the prevalence of digital and energy inequalities in Cambridge, and I focused on 4 key wards across the city: Newnham, Castle, Kings Hedges and Arbury. I wanted to understand the lived experience of being energy deprived and digitally excluded in Cambridge over the national lockdown. And in order to do this, I researched 10 resident interviews from across the 4 wards in Cambridge, and I also collaborated with many different research partners, including Cambridge Regional College, the North Cambridge Academy and the Cambridge Youth Panel. So Cambridge is currently the most unequal city in the UK. Cambridge also has the 50th lowest performing local authority for social mobility in the UK, and Cambridge is also the 5th lowest local authority for youth social mobility in England. So this means that children who are born poor in Cambridge are statistically more likely to remain poor throughout their lives, while wealthier children in the city are statistically more likely to retain this wealth throughout their lifetime. There are also significant inequalities between wards in the city. So for example, there is a 10-year life expectancy gap between those born in Newnham and Kings Hedges, with those being born in Newnham living 10 years longer. So a bit background to energy inequality and energy insecurity. So energy insecurity is the lack of adequate, affordable or acceptable clean sources of energy required for a healthy and sustainable life. And this is directly related to fuel poverty, as those who are fuel poor are also energy insecure. And there's 2 main reasons why an individual might be energy insecure or suffer from fuel poverty. The first being income insecurity. So families who are on 0-hour contracts, it's very difficult for them to budget how much they need for fuel because the hours are so irregular that it's very difficult for them to plan ahead and be able to know how much fuel they're going to need in the future. And the second being pay-as-you-go meters. So those on low incomes often have low credit scores, making it difficult for them to have direct debits for energy. So instead, they're forced to use a pay-as-you-go meter, which is anywhere between £100 and £300 more expensive annually. So they're also paying a lot more for fuel for the pure, simple reason that they have such a low credit score that they don't have an alternative. So there's many different impacts of fuel poverty that adversely affect both children and adults. So in childhood, there is adverse educational impacts. So firstly, in school, children who are suffering from fuel poverty are statistically more likely to experience bullying and stigmatization. This could be because their inability to wash frequently, they can't wash their school uniform as frequently. Other children might know that they're in a poor household and bully them as a result of this. But also these educational impacts follow through in the home environment. So families who are experiencing fuel poverty might not be able to put the heating on in all their rooms in their house. So they might just put their heating on in 1 or 2 rooms, limiting domestic life to this area. And therefore there might be younger siblings playing, their parents might be cooking, their other parents might be working and they're trying to study. And that makes it really difficult for these children. And in addition to this, they might have their own room where they can study, but it might be so cold that they can't concentrate properly and therefore perform less well academically as a result. These factors also affect adults. Parents are often stressed, affording energy and unpaid bills, affecting their mental health and resulting in high levels of depression and anxiety. And in addition to this, living in in fuel poverty can also affect your physical health, resulting in cardiovascular diseases, which then increase your chances of contracting and suffering complications from the coronavirus. Fuel poverty is a concerning issue, and I think it's going to become more increasingly present in the upcoming months. We are now entering winter, which is a period of time where we know fuel poverty increases, the temperature gets colder and more people as a result want to put on the heating. However, this year we're also dealing with rising fuel costs. Fuel costs are set to increase. We've had several energy companies going bust at the moment. So fuel is becoming more expensive. And simultaneously to this, they are cutting universal credit by approximately £20 a month. So not only are these families going to need more fuel because it's winter and the price is rising, the affordability of this is decreasing. So it's going to become a really difficult situation for these families. And there's going to be questions raised as to how they're going to afford fuel. So my research found that energy inequalities in Cambridge are prevalent, with access to energy and fuel poverty being most prevalent in Kings Hedges and Arbury. Prior to my research, there was a limited amount of research on this issue. So this is quite a novel study. So residents in Newnham and Castle presented no issues, stating that they were either fine and could afford their maintenance over the lockdown period, with several people reporting that they could afford plumbers and in case they had an issue. Whilst this was not replicated in Kings Hedges and Arbury, residents said that it was an extra cost that they hadn't expected. And one resident said that they had a problem with their heating and they had to buy some portable radiators until it was fixed. So they were limiting their domestic life to 1 or 2 rooms with these radiators. It made it increasingly difficult. And also they couldn't go out, so they were limited and had to spend all their time together. And that made their lives quite difficult. And these experiences do match the literature, which states that families struggled to cover the cost of heating over the pandemic, and they were forced to convert to non-traditional alternatives such as space heaters. So many residents were using space heaters to heat their homes, because either they couldn't afford the bills for the energy themselves, or they couldn't afford the maintenance to get people out to fix the issues, and they had to wait until they could afford the maintenance. But these unexpected costs of energy are concerning. It was estimated that over the national lockdown, families' energy bills increased by £16 a month. And that raises real questions that when universal credit is cut by £20 a month and the price of fuel is increasing, if there is another national lockdown, how will these families afford it? And this is something we really don't know and don't have the answers to. So I'll now move on to digital inequalities, where we'll look at access to digital technology, digital skills, and Cambridge's Digital Drive initiative. So digital inequalities are important, as these inequalities shape income, economic growth, and social mobility. In 2014, it was argued that technology was a necessity for all households, stating that digitally excluded individuals are unable to fully participate in society. And the key determinant of access to technology is income. The greater your income, the greater your access to digital technology, and the greater your access to quality digital technology as well. So not just having a laptop, but having one that works and having one with all the features that you'll need on it. And also broadband is also determined by your income level. With the greater your income, the greater your access to broadband. So digital access was seen essential in the pandemic. It was essential for online learning. So they found that over 1/3 of parents with children aged 5 to 16 reported a lack of access to their own computer, laptop, or tablet that they could use for home education. In schools where children lacked access to computers, teachers were forced to create packs of work and drive around to students' homes delivering packs of worksheets and workbooks. And they were obviously at a disadvantage to schools where everybody had a laptop and they could use Zoom and online learning and Teams, where they could get that face-to-face interaction with the teacher. And it is also increasingly difficult to search for employment in the pandemic if you were digitally excluded. So if you are on job seekers allowance, you're required to complete 35 hours of employment search a week. But this is challenging over the lockdown if you're digitally excluded, as access to libraries, community centres, and support to do this was not available to you, which was a real concern for these people. Having access to digital technology also enables you to have the ability to connect with others, prevent loneliness, and prevent isolation. It also allows you to work from home and maintain employment. And it also allowed you to access information about the coronavirus and essential services that moved online, such as doctors, GPs, and pharmacies. So I found that there was very high levels of disparity in access between those in Newnham, Castle, and then those in Kings Hedges and Arbury. Those in Newnham and Castle demonstrated that they had a great level of access, and that their access often exceeded the population of their household. So they often had more devices than people in the household. So one Castle resident said that there was 5 of them, and alone they had 8 laptops. They also all had a phone, and there was also additional tablets on top of that. Another family said they had 4 laptops and a home computer, iPads, and many of these families in Castle and Newnham were also given additional laptops by the companies that they work for. So we're building up an excess number of devices. However, residents in Kings Hedges and Arbury really were very limited in the level of digital technology that they had and the quality of the digital technology. So one family I spoke to in Kings Hedges, there was 2 adults and 2 children at a sixth form college, and they had just 2 laptops. So the parents needed the laptop to work from home, and the children needed the laptop to study. And it meant sort of switching turns with who was having the laptop when. The children couldn't study as much because they just didn't have the devices, and the parents couldn't work as productively because they were forced to share the laptop with their children. So this issue was also seen throughout different schools and educational providers in Cambridge. So when I spoke to the principal of Cambridge Regional College, he said that around 300 children at the college had poor or no broadband, and some had no laptop or computer and were instead trying to complete their studies on their mobile phone. And this was a similar situation in North Cambridge Academy, located in Kings Hedges, which said that more than half of the children were not going to be able to work from home, no matter how hard they tried. And the school had to resort to photocopying paper and driving it over to the children in order for them to do the work. Across wider Cambridge, it was and into the Fenlands and Peterborough, it's estimated that 9,400 children are without a laptop or computer, with an additional 3,082 households without internet connection over the pandemic. So the long-term effects of being digitally excluded is concerning, at both Cambridge Regional College and North Cambridge Academy. They did admit that learning was being lost as a result of being digitally excluded, particularly in North Cambridge Academy, where the children didn't have access to books and dictionaries to look things up in. So if they were digitally excluded, didn't have a phone, didn't have any means to get online, and then didn't understand the work, there was no real means of them to understand it and move ahead with it. So they were sort of stuck with their studies. And it's also concerning about the mental health issues of these children. There's a concern that due to the isolation and inability to get online, that these children will develop significant mental health issues in the future and upcoming months. But one thing that was very surprising that I found about my research was how the digital technology during the pandemic enabled individuals to access volunteering clubs and societies. Participating in these improves your social mobility, well-being, and confidence. And it can also help to combat loneliness and isolation over the lockdown period. So whilst children in Newnham and Castle were doing piano lessons, taking piano exams, or learning cooking lessons online, or learning a new language which could improve their employability skills and social mobility, children and adults in Kings Hedges and Arbury were just not taking part in these activities. I think one really prominent quote here is by the Kings Hedges resident at the bottom, saying, "My family really don't care about that. We don't like all that stuff," which suggests that not only were they not able to get online and do take part in these activities, even if they were, there's questions being raised as to would they take part in them anyway, or do they perceive there's some sort of barrier in place where they feel that these sorts of activities are not for them. And I think that this issue requires more research in the future to look at this specific issue in general. However, there was a beacon of light that came from this research, and that was really the work of the Cambridge Youth Panel. So at the start of the lockdown, the Cambridge Youth Panel identified that there was an issue, that some of the children were coming home and saying, half my class have a laptop, half the children in my class don't have a laptop, and there's something that we would like to do about it to help. So the Cambridge Youth Panel have been collecting laptops from these families in Newnham and Castle that have access devices, upgrading these devices, putting in new hard drives, putting in new software systems and redistributing them out to these children in Kings Hedges and Arbury, and really trying to make a difference to their lives, to improve their social mobility, to allow them to go to school, to allow online learning to take place. Their aim has been to distribute 4,500 laptops, which they estimate is only 50% of the total need in the city. Their work has shaped and will continue to change the lives of those living in Cambridge, improve these children's life chances, improving their social mobility, their educational prosperity, and increase their opportunities in the future. And on that note, I would just like to say thank you, Tarek, for supporting my research. I'd like to say thank you to everyone at the North Cambridge Academy for helping me get this research. Your contacts have been amazing, and I'd also like to say thank you very much to everyone at the Cambridge Youth Panel for inspiring me with the work that you're doing and that you still continue to do. Has anyone got any questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Eleanor. And just to note that on the point about the digital drive to get computers to people that need them, that I think today's Cambridge Independent had a feature about the kind of refresh and the relaunch of that drive, which was put together in partnership with a number of different organisations, which has gone quite well so far. So I think your research is adding to all the evidence that we know kind of anecdotally is adding kind of experience, the lived experience of people who actually experience of being affected at the sharp end as well. So it's really valuable from that point of view, and also highlights some other key areas of research that we should be pursuing and encouraging other researchers to undertake as well. So we have, let me just check the time. It's nearly 6:30, so we have about half an hour for discussion and questions. As ever, I invite you to either put your question in the chat or raise your hand, and myself and my colleagues George and Catherine will spot you and call on you to speak. Normally we finish about 7 o'clock on time, but we can overrun a little bit if we need to. All right. So yes, so please submit any questions or any comments. One of the things that I picked up from what you're saying is this whole idea of the perceived barrier, because even if people in Kings Hedges and Arbury had access, they felt that there was something else that was stopping them, that this wasn't for them. And I think that's a really interesting question. Can you elaborate a little bit further on that in your conversations? Because obviously you won't be able to put everything in the document or the slides.
So what I was really asking residents was, what did you do with your time over the lockdown? And were you part of any club or society? And whilst the residents in Newnham said that they were doing their cooking lessons or learning new languages, learning the piano, that was just not the case in Kings Hedges and Arbury. They were just not, some of them were too digitally excluded to be able to take part. Some of them didn't have the correct digital skills. So some of them couldn't get on Zoom or couldn't get on Teams in order to take part in these activities. Others said that they simply just didn't like them. And others suggested other barriers, one being price. It's obviously quite expensive to join some of these activities. I know the cooking lessons was like a corporate activity that people used to take part in. So price was is a barrier, and that's definitely needs to be overcome in order to make these activities more affordable, particularly these children's activities. And when I was talking to my colleague at the North Cambridge Academy, she said that they're doing a lot there to try and widen these participation activities, putting free clubs on Zoom for the children to take part in. they have like access days with different companies to encourage the children to take part in a range of activities such as coding, computer skills, filmmaking, and offering incentives for the children to do that. So there is barriers that need to be overcome, particularly in the digital skills area and the price. I would say they're the two biggest barriers that might encourage more people to get online and take part. But as I said, there is more barriers that we do need to look at, whether they feel that they just simply can't and it's not built for them. And that people like that are not, they don't perceive themselves as being able to access those activities. And I think that that's really, really sad if that is the case.
So we've got a couple of comments coming up on the chat. So James has said that James Lewis has said this has mirrored what other organizations have found as well. We're seeing a lot of people whose support networks are just cut off due to lockdown because they couldn't access the online services because of all the issues that you've outlined. Rich Alderton, today Boris's conference speech, which I sadly missed, has been all about levelling up and making us a high-tech, high-value added society. What advice do you have for your PM based on your research, your excellent research?
Well, my first piece of advice would be, please don't cut the universal credit by £20. Boris, you might think £20 isn't very much, but to these residents in Kings Hedges and Arbury, that £20 has been a lifeline. It's enabled them to heat their home. It's enabled them to get online. It's enabled them to have one less stress in their lives. By cutting that £20, it's going to make it's going to make fuel unaffordable for these people. That's going to add more stress to their lives. It's going to make the existing pressures of living in poverty even harder, and it's going to severely affect them. So my first advice would be, please don't cut the universal credit. And my second advice would be, please help people with their digital skills in getting online. I know it's really expensive, but please try and find some ways to make sure children, especially in the pandemic, had access to a laptop to do the online school, or a tablet for online school. And that would have just really helped them. It would have enabled them to interact with their friends, their classmates, their teachers, ask questions, complete homework, do coursework, interact, take part in these clubs and activities and societies that they might otherwise not be able to. I think that would be my two biggest pieces of research to Boris this week.
Thank you. I mean, I would have some advice, but it's not actually repeatable in public forum. But anyway, so James Lewis has made an interesting point as well. James, do you want to come in and say a little bit more about the complexity of accessing deals, so you just don't have to listen to my voice all the time?
So I've just moved to Cambridge Online, and I was working at CHS doing digital inclusion, and we found a lot of people during lockdown who were struggling with getting online. There was a very significant proportion, I'm certainly not going to say all, but there was certainly a significant number of people that I worked with where the difficulty they had with connectivity was actually around understanding what the options were for them and what they could afford. There's a whole load of issues around people thinking they can't get anything because of credit history, because they just don't really know what's out there, because of inertia and fear of looking for a new deal or losing their phone number. Just to give one example, we had a lady who had a £20 Tesco mobile contract before lockdown started. And she was finding, when we spoke to her, that she was spending about close to £60 a month to get online because she was buying add-ons for her contract for data so that she could access Zoom stuff, etc. And obviously she was, on benefits. That was a huge amount of money for her to try and find, and no wonder she was struggling with that. And, that was at the time where the best deal available for her would have been about, I think, £16 a month for unlimited data. And even then, actually, that inertia meant that she chose to stick with a more expensive deal with Tesco's Mobile, but she still saved about £30 a month just by actually having that conversation with her and helping her to look at what the options were. And, you know, actually almost, I would say pretty much every person I spoke to was able to either get more data for less money or actually were able to get, significantly reduce their costs if they were already on unlimited data. So there's something there around, somebody mentioned about empowerment there in the chat. I think there is something about empowering people to understand what's available, helping them think more creatively about what their options are, because people sometimes, I found as well, were saying, I can't really afford to pay more. And then you spoke to them and it was like, I'm paying £10 a month, a week rather, for their top ups. And it's like, well, that's actually £40–50 a month. And actually, if you, rather than doing it on a month by, week by week basis on top ups, you can look at some of these other deals that don't require a credit check, that can actually work with somebody who can't, go into a contract. But it's people not being aware of what's out there, what the options are and how to access them. That can often, not always, and we definitely need to do more work in terms of supporting people financially. But there is definitely something that can be done while we're waiting for that silver bullet to come along. There's definitely something that can be done around, from a kind of consumer point of view, really empowering people to know what's available and take advantage of it. Not to mention the actual social tariffs that are out there.
James, I'm interested in this issue about the transparency of deals, because there was, and I think still is, a problem with energy deals, for example. Exactly what are you buying? How much is it costing you? What are you comparing? Is this? Do you feel? I mean, do you think this is a deliberate kind of strategy to try and maximize revenue for companies, to try and make it as complex as possible, or is it just a function of the way the markets work?
Well, I think you've got two different markets. You've got the landline broadband, and undoubtedly there is a strategy of hook people in cheap and then jack the cost up. And for some broadband, they can count on more inertia than others. So with Virgin, for example, it's tends to be tied into television, which some people want, but also can be harder to get off. Like if you want to keep your phone number, we left Virgin. My household left Virgin years ago, and we ended up having to give up our phone number because it was just too difficult to try and get it ported across. So there's those kinds of issues, but definitely within the landline broadband, I think there's a real strategy of complex deals and actually keeping people on a low cost deal. Where they're not able to really deal with the hassle of switching, if you like. That becomes really difficult unless they're able to claim something like BT Basic and they're eligible for that. Mobiles, it's a different thing, and I think it's people being aware of SIM-only deals and things like that. It's not so complex, I think, and obviously there's been some regulation changes in the last couple of years which should help with that as well. But it's just not very well known. It's not out there. People don't necessarily know that there are these kind of rolling contracts that maybe don't require a credit check at all, and they're generally on these kind of virtual networks that are a lot cheaper than the same companies that are actually providing the connectivity. To them, obviously, and still making a profit. They're charging 4 times the same price to their customers direct, which I think it's hard to see how that isn't exploitative, if you ask me.
Thank you. So G, you were making a point about whether we actually do need more research or not, and you were citing the example of the way that communities empowered themselves in Queen Edith's. Do you want to come in and just elaborate on that a bit?
I'll do a little bit. And I should point out that I'm speaking with two hats. One is with my donut economics hat on. The other one is I know a reasonable amount about what some of the things that Sam Davis has been doing in Queen Edith's with the community. I think this is the kind of stuff that we expect, right? Poverty is a trap. What happens when you're poor is that something else goes wrong, with your health or with your education. And it's a vicious circle. It's very difficult to escape once you start slipping down that slope, and anything can trigger that slope, and people can be on the edge of it for a long time, and then something goes wrong and they start sliding down it, and it's terrible. So I think we know this happens, and I think it's we should be trying to do something about it and not trying to find out more data about the fact that it's happening. Although I think this is good supporting data, and it will encourage us to think about things. One thing, I actually think the people in these positions are actually very resourceful. And I do understand what we're saying about we could tell them about better phone deals and things like that. I think they're pretty resourceful. I don't think there's a conspiracy against them by companies, but somebody who sometimes pays their bill and sometimes doesn't, and who you have to chase them constantly, it's obvious you're going to penalize them with business tariffs and so on. And unfortunately, that's part of the trap. And we know somebody, for example, who is on a pay-as-you-go meter and has had to spend literally hours a day trying to get through to them to get their electricity reinstated, and incurring a huge phone bill while they do that. So, as soon as they start falling behind, they've got a £20 phone bill just to get themselves reconnected. But the fundamental thing is these people are very resourceful. They're just in a terrible trap, which is draining their resources. And I think giving them the ability to help each other as a community is one of the most powerful things we can do. I think for those of us who are lucky enough to not have some of these problems, we don't necessarily need the same degree of social support around us to navigate the problems. Whereas if we can connect the communities together and help them to help each other, that's very powerful.
Thank you, G. Robert Pollock, you asked a question. If your connection's good enough, would you like to come in and ask it? I know Robert's been having problems with his connection, so I'll just read it out. So, Eleanor, when you spoke to young people in Kings Hedges, did they tell you what they most wanted or needed to improve their day-to-day lives?
I wasn't able to speak to the children themselves. I was only able to speak to their teachers and their parents and guardians. In Kings Hedges and in North Cambridge Academy in particular, the biggest thing that they needed was ambition. They needed their children and their pupils to be ambitious and to think outside of even their little ward of Kings Hedges and Arbury, and to think wider than that into what they could do with their lives. And what opportunities they have out there for them beyond this. So one thing that they've been doing there is that they have been, so they've set up a partnership with ARM, who make the microchips. So ARM is giving them an experience day at ARM, a competition where they can learn coding, they can learn about the company and all different things that happen at ARM, because ARM is next door to them, yet these children have never been to ARM. They don't know anything about it. They don't know anything about the science park in which their community is based. And so they've been allowing them to go in there and encouraging them to do things like go to university, even study A-levels, and supporting them through that process to try and become something outside, to think more broadly and more generally. And I think that that's something that we should really be focusing on for these children, is encouraging them to think what they can become and to unlock the potential that they have, because they're very talented and bright and very academic and articulate pupils at the school. It's just having an ability to unlock that potential and that belief within them to go on and fulfill that potential to the greatest benefit that they can.
Thank you. And Peter is making a comment about the digital commons, which is an interesting concept. And I was thinking about the way that the Cambridge Youth Panel works, because they actually train young people to actually upgrade the computers themselves. So that is a way of empowering and meeting a kind of direct need that they have as well. I think you had conversations with Cambridge Youth Panel, yeah. What was your take on that?
while the children and the young people who are at the Cambridge Youth Panel are some of the most inspiring young people I think I've ever met, to have the initiative to come home from school one day and decide half of the children in my class have a laptop and half the children in my class don't have a laptop, and what's going to happen to them children is something really inspiring. So they started off going around to businesses and asking them if they have any old laptops. So there's a lot of companies obviously in the science park and in the biomedical park that constantly need the latest edition of laptop that's come out. So they have old laptops that they are basically sitting in cupboards going unused. So they took them laptops and started to redistribute them out to the children. They also had some money that they were using for a different project. And with that money, they bought 50 Chromebooks, Google Chromes, which they thought would plug the gap. And then they quickly realized that that issue was much wider than that. And then 50 Chromebooks weren't going to go far enough. So they then ran this scheme where you could donate a laptop of any sort of quality to them, and they would put on the new software for you, make sure Zoom can work on it, make sure Teams will work on it, ensure there's all the platforms for online learning on it, and then distribute them out back to the community and tell and inform the community that these laptops are free and there's no price barrier, and that they can keep them forever. So they started doing that, and then they found out that they had this inequality issue in mind from the start. So they didn't want one child to get a slightly old like MacBook Pro and then another child to get a HP thing from about 2005. So they started to develop a scheme where if your laptop was worth more than £800, they would swap it in with a company for that equivalent value, and then use that to repurpose and buy a different laptop. So when you're going to the schools, one child's not getting like a brand new, really flashy, whizzy thing, and then someone else is getting a slightly older device, because that would in turn create an inequality in terms of one child could do a lot more with that laptop than another. And so that's what they were doing at the youth panel. And that sort of what came out of the North Cambridge Academy, and the issues there were about half the students didn't have a device at all.
Thank you.
And
yeah.
I think it's been a real success.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And hopefully the relaunch of the Digital Drive campaign will mean more donations and we'll be able to meet the need that's still out there. So George is reminding everybody that we are live tweeting. George, thank you again for doing that, and feel free to share our Cam Commons handle on that. And Rick is pointing out that the universal credit card is £20 a week, not a month. Okay, and James is making the point about the not being able to afford to repair a device if it goes wrong. And I think one of the issues is actually it's not that straightforward to repair something. These days it's actually quite complicated. I mean, I know from my own experience of having just slightly cracked a screen on a tablet that it meant that the insurance wouldn't kind of just repair the screen. It was written off and you had to go and replace it completely, and that seemed to me a huge waste of resources as well, and it kind of points out a kind of fundamental flaw about how these devices are designed and built. James, do you want to come in and say a little bit more about that? And George, you've got a question as well?
Oh, so yeah,
James, go ahead.
I think one of the key points that kind of highlighted to me is the need isn't going to go away, because we've been handing out devices. Cambridge Youth Panel have been handing out devices. There's been a number of schemes out there to get devices to people. But as I say, it's not just people who weren't online who now need a device. It was also people who were just about online, and then, you know, due to that sort of precariousness that I think it was Greg was talking about, you know, one thing goes wrong, and then potentially you've got that kind of cascade effect. And I think, you know, your device going kaput can be that, you know, the start of that landslide, if I can mix my metaphors. So I think one of the things I'm keen to highlight, and, you know, be talking about it in a couple of weeks' time, really, is that we have to be very careful that we don't think that when lockdown kind of fully subsides, we've tackled this, we've done it, we've sorted it, it's done and gone, and this isn't an issue anymore. And digital inclusion is, you know, we've you know, that's great, we fixed that. What's the next problem? I think we've got to recognise that, you know, unless we can get much more, you know, social and financial equality, then there's going to continue to be a need for people to be supported, to be able to afford devices and afford connectivity, you know, going forward indefinitely, because there will always be people that are going to struggle without that support, and, you know, and it only becomes more and more support, you know, important that they do.
Okay, thank you. George?
Eleanor, I was really interested in your comments and the research you've done. I think super interesting to have had that insight from talking to people and talking directly to their experiences and in different communities across Cambridge as well, and just to show what a different world we inhabit, even within the confines of what's actually a very small city. And that strikes me as quite sort of powerful insight. In both parts of that, the digital element, there was obviously that quite striking observation about, well, you know, Zoom clubs are not for us, we don't do that stuff. And I can imagine some people responding to that by saying, well, you know, there you go, they don't have enough ambition, and there's not, you know, which is a sort of view I would really disagree with. But then within the energy comments you were making, there was something about the real challenge of making choices when you don't have, when you are living with fuel poverty. You know, do you pay for this or that? You know, do you have a shower? And that's probably something that everybody could identify with as being an invidious choice. And I'm interested to know, you know, how did people that you spoke to make that choice, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that my research, both in Cambridge and also my wider reading, found out that the biggest challenge for a lot of families in fuel poverty is whether you heat your home or feed your family. And that choice is something that's I can only imagine one of the hardest choices you would have to make. Whether you feed your children, or keep them warm and give them a bath. And for a lot of the families, the food came first. So they were really thankful when the pandemic did hit, with the Marcus Rashford food campaign, that just alleviated a little bit of pressure, especially in the school holidays. That meant that they weren't having to spend that additional money on food. They could put that towards their energy bills. So they were really thankful for that, particularly. And that was both in Cambridge, but also in wider nationally. In terms of the other challenges about whether you shower or wash or however else you use your energy, that's when sort of the space heaters come in. So you're not actually turning on your radiator, you're like plugging in an electric heater. And obviously your electric bill will go up, but not as much as what your actual fuel bill would go up by. And that would therefore alleviate some of that and allow for a bit more hot water. But yeah, the hot water does turn off for these families. And that's sort of where, especially in the school environment, the bullying and the stigmatization comes from, because the children in the classroom think, oh, that child can't wash as frequently, so they're smelly, they're dirty, they don't have a clean uniform. And that's where that sort of spiral starts in school, essentially, that they then don't want to go to school, because then children say, well, you're smelly and you're dirty and you're this, but then they've got a difficult home life too, because they go home and it's cold and they haven't got any hot water at home either. So for these children, there's really, in a sense, nowhere. There's no sort of safe haven for them. And that's really, I think that's quite concerning, that what do we do? But I said the free meals did help and will continue to help for as long as they're there. But if that's taken away as well, that will additionally add pressures to these families.
Okay, and I think it's frustrating and exasperating when you hear politicians talk about, you know, the fact that, you know, £20 cut in universal credit a week isn't that much, whereas it is a lot in monetary terms for a lot of people, but it also doesn't take account of the kind of compound effects of that in the way that you're describing, the kind of long-term impact of not being able to wash every day and not being able to heat your home, and the educational impact as well. So I think that's an important lesson to draw out of this. It's the connectivity, interconnectedness between different examples of poverty, like fuel poverty and digital poverty as well. And I think there is a need to understand that a bit better and to kind of feed that into government policy making so that it's taken account of. Okay, are there any more questions? I can see that Peter's made a comment about Professor Sugata Mitra of Newcastle University, who I actually know about his research on self-organized learning, which is very, very interesting. There's a very good TED talk about that, which is worth looking at. So it's a way of empowering young people to organize their own education, and it's quite an eye-opening example of how that can be affected. So thank you, Peter, for that. Are there any further questions or comments to be made? We're coming to the end of our session, so I think I just want to say thank you to you, Eleanor, and good luck in your masters. You're staying on to do a masters at York. Tell us a little bit more about what you're going to be focusing on.
So I'm doing a masters this year in corporate sustainability and environmental management at the University of York. So I'm doing things like environmental impact assessments, ICCP, TFTD reporting. And this year I have to do a master's research dissertation project as well. So if anyone is looking for any research in sustainability, my email's on the last slide. It's eleanor.daws@gmail.com. But yeah, I am looking for another research project this year. So if there's any research that anyone would like, drop me an email and I'll be more than happy to help. But again, thank you very much for coming.
We have had quite a lot of interaction on Twitter as well. So thank you, George, as ever, for keeping that conversation going. And there was a request there was a question about whether or not the research could be made available. And I think we can probably find a way to put it on our website if you're happy for us to put it there as well. So we will deal with that. Any other questions, George, that you picked up on Twitter? Any other comments that you might want to highlight?
You are quicker than me, Tarek. I haven't anything specific. But yeah, great talk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eleanor, and thank you everybody for participating as well and for your contributions. Look out for our November meeting, which is also likely to be our AGM as well. And we are, as ever, very, very keen to find new volunteers to help us, particularly with the comms, helping us get kind of the website and the communications with our members, helping to improve that. And also we need a treasurer too. And if anybody's interested in joining our committee and helping us, we're interested in perhaps people who might want to take ownership of a portfolio. So it could be somebody who wants to engage with issues on fuel poverty or digital exclusion or housing or any other aspect of inequality. So we're not saying necessarily that you should come and just do all the admin. We want you to kind of take ownership of an issue and help us to source speakers and to organize talks and events around that as well. So if anybody's interested in that, if anybody knows somebody who might be interested, then let us know and look out for our meeting notice for November. So thank you again, everybody, and good night. Catherine, I think you can stop the recording now.